Have you ever wanted to bathe in the homoerotic splendor of the greatest bromance in anime history, which of course is the love affair between Griffith and Guts in Berserk? If the answer to that question is yes, then I have a video for you. This video is a supercut of 4 previously released essays where I examine the Guts-Griffith bromance from a variety of perspectives. It's some of my favorite work on this channel, so I hope you enjoy it. I believe that the most important questions in the early episodes of Berserk concern Griffith's relationship to Guts. Because Griffith is kind of a black box, it can be really hard to get inside of his head, so it's hard to know what Guts actually means to him. Does Griffith love Guts? Is Guts just a tool to him? Does the relationship stay the same? Does it evolve? And since Griffith is so hard to read, what evidence would we even look for to answer these questions? Well, I think that episode 12 is a great place to start. During that episode, Casca tells a little story about her history with Griffith, and her insight helps us to understand what makes Guts so different in Griffith's eyes relative to anybody else who's ever joined the Band of the Hawk, including Casca. And what we learn is that Griffith has a policy of always giving everyone a choice. Everyone gets a choice to join his Band of the Hawk if they wish, or to leave if they wish. Everybody who fights for Griffith does so freely and on their own terms. And Griffith doesn't adopt this policy out of the kindness of his own heart. It is a selfish gesture that he does in order to avoid guilt over all of the human life that's lost under his watch and because of his dreams. The way that Griffith sees it, if his soldiers freely choose to fight, then he is not responsible for their death, because his soldiers are responsible for their own choices. So that any number of soldiers can die on Griffith's behalf, but his conscience is nevertheless clean and pure, because he is not responsible for how his soldiers freely choose to live and die. But there was one exception to this system that Griffith had devised to absolve himself of any responsibility for all of the loss of life of which he is the cause, and that exception was Guts. Because you have to remember, Griffith literally acquired Guts as a slave in episode 3, for that was the stakes of the duel that took place between them. Guts was fighting for his freedom, and he lost, and so Griffith claimed dominion over his life and death. But it turns out that in Griffith's own twisted psyche, which is the psyche of a sinister and brutal man, this was actually a paradoxical expression of his genuine admiration and care for Guts. The greatest expression of respect that Griffith can show Guts is to deny Guts his autonomy and make Guts his obedient soldier through a show of force. And the reason for this is that in Griffith's own moral system, he thereby assumes responsibility for Guts' life and death. Guts does not freely choose to fight for Griffith, and so Guts is not responsible for what happens to himself in battle, whether he lives or dies. Griffith is responsible for that, and Griffith feels that burden in his psyche. And what's most important of all, that is a burden that Griffith is unwilling to bear for anybody else. That's why he lets everybody else join him freely. Guts is the only person whose life is worth taking responsibility for in Griffith's eyes, and Guts is the only person whose death is able to reach Griffith's conscience. And Guts acquires this unique meaning to Griffith because Griffith owns him. That is Griffith's way of showing which soldier he prizes above all others. But this unique value that Guts holds in Griffith's eyes doesn't last. It's only something that Guts enjoys in the first 3 years of his time with the Hawks, and it begins to crack as Griffith finally ascends to the royal court of Midland and increasingly curries the king's favor. And we can also pinpoint the precise moment when the value that Guts holds in Griffith's eyes shatters completely. It happens in episode 9 when Griffith asks Guts to assassinate a noble in the king's court. But when Griffith gives this task to Guts, he offers him a choice. He does not force him to do it. And when you first watch this series, this actually looks like an expression of Griffith's respect for Guts, because Griffith knows that he's making Guts do a dirty deed that's fundamentally different from fighting on the battlefield. And so Griffith himself makes it look like he's giving Guts the option to decline this task out of a kind of love and respect for him. But in Griffith's private world, it's precisely the opposite that's happening. Giving Guts a choice symbolizes the way in which Griffith wants to wash his hands of Guts and relieve himself of any responsibility for Guts' life. Because remember, giving people freedom is Griffith's way of keeping his conscience clean of all the death that he brings into the world. And Guts used to be the exception, but now something has changed. Now that Griffith has ascended amongst the ranks of the nobility, Guts is no longer worthy of his concern. Guts is like any other soldier, disposable, meaningless. And I believe that this is the moment when Griffith's relationship to Guts was definitively broken. It happened by Griffith's own hand because he believed that Guts was no longer worthy of his love. I think about the homoeroticism in Berserk more than I care to admit, and there's one scene in particular in episode 7 that I just can't get out of my mind. See, during the aftermath of a battle, Guts has a little private conversation with Griffith, and during this conversation, he works up the courage to ask Griffith what he actually means to him. Because the thing is, Griffith is a great man and a great leader of many hundreds of soldiers, and Guts is merely one of those hundreds. And by all rights, Guts should be completely disposable, completely interchangeable with any other. And yet, every time Guts is in mortal danger, Griffith risks his life to save him, and he does this in a way that he does for no other of his soldiers. So Guts finally works up the courage to ask Griffith, why does he do this? What does Guts actually mean to him? But Griffith is very coy about his response. He refuses to answer Guts outright. He simply asks him, Guts, do you really need an answer when time and again I lay my life down for you? Do my actions themselves not tell you everything you need to know? And that is all Griffith will reveal about the workings of his own heart. And that whole conversation between Griffith and Guts, that is actually the context for the scene that I really want to talk about, which happens later that very night. Guts finds a private space on the roof of some house to ponder Griffith's words to him in isolation. And we, the audience, are invited to listen to Guts' internal monologue, where he kind of convinces himself that Griffith, after all, really does love him. Because apparently Guts really needs this validation, so if Griffith won't give it to him explicitly, Guts is going to tell himself a little story where he can make sense of what he means to Griffith. And the thing that I love about this scene so much and that I keep thinking about is that the entire time that Guts is telling himself this little story about how much Griffith really does love him, he's also holding his sword in such a way that the sword unmistakably looks like a giant phallus. And even though that phallic symbol is objectively hilarious, it's also played with utter deadly seriousness in the show, which frankly I have a lot of respect for, because I think Berserk is great. And the deadly seriousness with which this phallic image is presented to the viewer has made me ask myself the following question. What is its artistic purpose? What is it trying to communicate about Guts? And well, I've thought about this question for a while, and I want to tell you what my answer is. First of all, it's pretty clear that Guts' sword functions as a substitute for the phallus. And I want to tell you why I think this substitution in particular expresses something important about the psychological truth of Guts' relationship to Griffith. Because here's the thing. Earlier, during Guts' conversation with Griffith, the whole reason why he wanted to know what he means to Griffith is because he can see that he is more than an ordinary soldier in Griffith's eyes. But here's a question. If Guts is more than a soldier to Griffith, what is it about Guts that makes him more than a soldier to Griffith? Well, here's the paradox. Guts is more than a soldier to Griffith because Guts is so good at being a soldier for Griffith. He is the greatest soldier of all time. And that makes him more than a soldier. It makes him Griffith's beloved. Because Griffith loves great soldiers. And this is the reason why Guts' sword is also more than a sword. Guts' sword is more than a mere sword in the same way that he is more than a mere soldier. The sword is also the tool by which Guts wins Griffith's love, because Guts' proficiency with it knows no equal. And for that reason, it also symbolically acquires the status of a phallus. And in particular, it acquires that status precisely during Guts' private musings, when he contemplates the way in which he has won a position as Griffith's special boy. The pivotal moment for Guts' development in Berserk was his decision to part ways with Griffith and the Band of the Hawk. But if you look at that decision from the outside, it doesn't make a lot of sense. Guts loved the Hawks, and they loved him. They were like the family that he never had. And the Hawks had just become the king's favorite company in all of Midland. There really was an important sense in which Guts had everything a mercenary could ask for out of life. And yet it was at that very moment that Guts decided that he must leave the Hawks and forge his own path. But what was it that could have driven Guts to leave this life behind that looked so happy when examined from the outside? Well, Guts gives us an answer in episode 14 during a conversation with Casca. Guts confesses to Casca that he has recently undergone a change of heart. He has become a different person than he was when he first joined the Band of the Hawk 3 years ago. For in the beginning, Guts was content simply to fight with his sword, because that's all he ever knew. He neither wanted nor needed a reason to fight, because what Guts really wanted was to follow others, to follow Griffith, and to let him decide why war must be waged. But then something happened to Guts, and all at once he realized that this way of existing in the world wasn't enough for him any longer, because Guts could suddenly see that this made him different from other people, and not for the better. Other people have reasons of their own to fight their battles. Casca does not fight merely to fight. She does it because she dreams of a higher purpose by Griffith's side, and she fights in order to make that dream a reality. And it's the same with every other hawk. It may not be true that each and every one of them dreams of ruling the world in the way that Griffith does, but each has his own humble purpose for which he fights. Gaston fights to raise funds for a business. Nicole seeks to become an officer to win a woman's heart. Every one of them dreams of a higher purpose, and every one of the hawks fights to make their own private purpose come to pass. And Guts has suddenly understood that this makes him different, because there is no higher purpose outside of battle that he dreams to realize. And something about this newfound knowledge has made his life incomplete. It drains his life of meaning. It pains him now to live without a reason to fight. And though he is ready to dream of a higher purpose, he also cannot find it amongst the hawks. And that is the reason why he has decided to leave. It is simply too painful to continue fighting without any meaning to call his own. But if this is in fact the reason why Guts left the Band of the Hawk, it seems to raise more questions than it answers. But to me personally, one question stands out among all others. What is the origin of this new desire for purpose in Guts' heart? Where does it come from? Because Guts never needed a dream in his past. He never needed a reason to fight in his past. He spent 3 years with the Hawks, 3 happy years, fighting simply to survive because Griffith told him to. So why is that not enough any longer? Well, I believe something very important took place between Guts and Griffith in episode 10, which triggered this sudden transformation in Guts' soul. It was a speech that Griffith delivered to Charlotte, the king's daughter, but the speech wasn't intended for Guts' ears. He listened in secret, and what he heard shattered his self-conception and destroyed his faith in the love that Griffith has for him. And it was in the wreckage of his heart that there awoke a new need to dream of a higher purpose beyond the savage life of war and violence. Because that old life was premised on Griffith's love. He was content to let Griffith decide where and when and for what purpose Guts should fight. Because Guts was his beloved. Guts was the one that Griffith loved. Or at least this is what Guts believed. But Griffith's secret speech to Charlotte told a different story. In that speech, Griffith explained to Charlotte what makes a man worthy of his love. And it's not his ferocity as a warrior or his willingness to obey. As far as Griffith is concerned, a man's worth is measured by the greatness of the dreams that drive him to fight. The greater the dream, the greater the man. For what Griffith loves above all is a man's power to impose his will upon the world and shape it into the image of what he desires. For that is the man who dreams. And though there are men who do not dream and who have no higher purpose and who do not seek to change the world, such a man can be no friend to Griffith. Because as Griffith believes, that man is already dead, though his body may live, and he is worthy of contempt. A man who does not seek to change the world by imposing his dream may just as well not exist, as far as Griffith is concerned. These were Griffith's words to Charlotte. And you know, in the moment when Guts heard that Griffith despises men who have no dreams and who seek to realize no purpose, in that very moment, the camera presents a close-up of Guts' face. And his eyes are wide with shock and pain and a kind of recognition. And though he doesn't say outright what's going through his head, the implication is clear. Guts suddenly realizes that Griffith is talking about him. Guts is the man without dreams who is dead. And Griffith has just said in the plainest of terms that such a man cannot be a friend to him. And I believe that it is this moment of recognition where Guts overheard Griffith's secret speech to Charlotte and saw that Griffith in fact despises him, or at the very least that Griffith claims to despise him as he whispers into the ear of the king's daughter. This moment is what triggers the epiphany in episode 14, where Guts tells Casca why he has decided to leave the Band of the Hawk. He can no longer stand to fight without a higher purpose, without a dream, though he was once content simply to fight to survive, and to let Griffith concern himself with the reason why Guts should fight. For you see, Guts was never fighting merely to fight or merely to survive. He was fighting for Griffith, because he believed that he was loved by Griffith, and that is what was enough. And there was nothing else beyond Griffith's love that Guts required. And yet, as Guts has learned, that love was a lie. For Griffith holds him in contempt. And if Guts does not have Griffith's love, then what does he have? He has nothing. And nothing is not enough for Guts. And that is what drove him to leave the Band of the Hawk. Did you ever ask yourself why Griffith is so beautiful in Berserk? And I mean this as like a question of artistic design. Why did Kentaro Miura create Griffith to look the way that he does? Because the thing is, Griffith's beauty is extremely striking within the context of Berserk. It's a very feminine beauty. It's delicate and radiant, and he has this long flowing hair. And no one that Griffith surrounds himself with looks like him either. He is, after all, the leader of a mercenary band, and all of his men look very traditionally masculine. And one exception to this rule might be Casca, who is of course a very beautiful woman. But Griffith's beauty nevertheless seems to have a more traditionally feminine quality, at least when they're dressed up as mercenaries. I guess you could say he's like the prettiest one in the room. And he certainly contrasts powerfully with Guts, who is of course beautiful in his own way. But Guts has an extremely masculine beauty. He has the beauty of a big, strong, scary man who has a surprisingly tender heart. So the real question here is, why does Griffith have this very unique, delicate, feminine beauty? What storytelling purpose does it serve? Well, I actually think that there's a lot of different answers that you could give to this question, and I'm not going to give you all of them in this video. But there is one answer that I do want to talk about, which has to do with the romantic subtext between Griffith and Guts. Because even though they don't become a couple or anything, their relationship is nevertheless driven by a very powerful erotic tension. And Guts in particular is driven by a very powerful erotic fixation on Griffith during his stay with the Band of the Hawk. And because Berserk is a visual story, Kentaro Miura needed to design the visual dimension of Griffith's character in a way that would help the reader, or for that matter the viewer, make sense of Guts' fascination with him. We need to be able to see Griffith in the way that Guts sees Griffith. Not just as some guy who happens to be very powerful, but as a radiantly beautiful object of erotic fascination. And I think that that's the reason why Miura designed Griffith not only to be beautiful, but also to have a very feminine kind of beauty. Part of what's going on here is that Griffith's feminine beauty provides balance to Guts' masculine beauty. This opposition between two kinds of beauty is supposed to be a coded representation of the erotic magnetism that draws them together. It is as though Griffith's feminine beauty complements and completes Guts' masculine beauty, and that is the reason why Guts longs for him. And I also have another theory about the cultural context of the late 80s and early 90s in which Miura was first making Berserk. I think that this historical context can explain part of the reason why Miura felt that he needed Griffith to be a feminine complement to Guts' masculine beauty. During this time, it was a lot more rare to see gay relationships in popular art, and I actually don't know enough about the history of Japanese culture and society to explain why that would be the case over there. I don't really know about the censorship laws that might have affected this, or if it was more perhaps about homophobic cultural norms, or if there was some other explanation. But the fact is that Berserk was designed in accordance with a very heteronormative and patriarchal cultural logic. And that logic works by representing erotic relationships in terms of masculine and feminine counterparts. And so if you want to code two male characters as gay in accordance with this logic, one of them has to be the masculine one and the other has to be the feminine one. And that's how it works between Guts and Griffith. It's really the cultural logic of patriarchal norms that demand that Griffith be represented with this extremely feminine beauty in order to code him as an object of homoerotic fascination for the extremely masculine Guts. Or at least that's my theory. Let me know in the comments what you think about this.